Hey everyone, welcome back to Between the Frames, the interlude episodes between the regular season episodes of Make This Movie, where I do a little deeper dive into the topics we've discussed as they relate to the section of filmmaking that we just wrapped up. This is naturally the final Between the Frames episode of Season 1, because we have just wrapped post-production. So in this episode, we actually have a lot to cover because we're covering ground for two pretty dense episodes. Post-production is a lengthy topic. Before we dive into that, I just want to give a quick reminder. If you're liking the show, please rate and review it on iTunes. It helps us out a lot. If you're getting a lot out of it, or if you're just enjoying it from a narrative perspective, put that in the comments if you could on iTunes and help it reach more people who like the same stuff as you, like I always say. And also, if you feel so inclined, it would mean a lot if you could share the podcast on social media with your friends, with your family members, whoever it's relevant to. Share it in groups that you run. Share it on forums if you'd like, and just send it to people who you think would enjoy it. Spread it as far and wide as you can in preparation for next year when we also do Season 2. And also, for another quick reminder, if you want to get more out of the topics that we're covering, even more than I can cover in Between the Frames or than is covered in the episodes, please feel free to visit showhawk.com/makethismovie. I've plugged it before on pretty much every episode. That's showhawk.com/makethismovie. And there you'll find our in-depth toolkit for micro-budget filmmaking. Each installment in that toolkit goes along with each episode of the podcast that we've done so far. And you'll get more in-depth guides and specific tools that we used, tutorials, all kinds of great stuff that they'll help you along in the process of making your own film. What that's essentially become is like a free book. It's chapter by chapter, different facets of this filmmaking process as it relates to counterintelligence and as it could relate to your own film. It's become a really cool tool. We're getting a lot of really great feedback on it, and I'm really proud of it. Like I said, it's shaping up into essentially a book. So please go to showhawk.com/makethismovie, sign up. You'll get access to that. If you're looking at making a film of your own, I can guarantee with some degree of certainty that it'll definitely be of service for you. So now let's jump right in. We got a lot to cover, like I said. Post-production is tricky, particularly when you're taking my approach and doing the vast majority of it yourself. Much of our post was done only by me, with the score and sound mix being done by Noah Simons and Mike Elliott, respectively, which we covered in the last episode on post-production. If you're making a micro-budget film, you'll probably be in a similar situation. In this BTF, I want to cover some nuanced details of that process and some overriding philosophies and approaches. And I also want to look at how to work with other collaborators, like an editor, if you have one, or a colorist, if you have one, or a sound designer, etc. And that'll also translate into sound mixer, composer, as well. And since we spent a lot of time on post-production organization in the episodes themselves, because that organizational foundation really heavily impacts how those processes go, I want to explore focusing on your creative vision to make the best movie you can with what you have. We're going to cover a host of topics, though, that only being one of them. And what we're going to cover specifically here are the facets of post from start to finish, doing post from the start, as in the earliest parts of making your film, managing the post-production workflow, collaboration in post, and the creative post process, like I said before. So without further ado, let's jump right into the facets of post. The facets of post from start to finish are file management, the edit, color, sound design, sound mix, and visual effects. when you're staring down the barrel of post, you've wrapped production, or maybe you're part of the way through production and you're sort of getting warmed up to post, this is what you're looking at as a comprehensive process. So let's go through each of those. I'll go through them as quickly as I can because some of you probably are already acquainted. First, let's start with file management. What this includes are video imports and audio imports, buckets or events, as in how you organize your footage in your editing system, and syncing clips. So what that kind of amounts to, video imports and audio imports, when your files are shot, captured on a capture device or on a camera card or a hard drive, at some point they have to come into the editing software for you to edit them. It sounds pretty self-explanatory, right? But there's a few things that you want to keep in mind when you're doing this. In most cases, those files need to be transcoded, which means they need to be converted from a compressed file on a camera card to a editable, more raw file. So in the case of our production, we captured onto the Atomos Shogun, which is the capture device we covered in the production, or in the pre-production section, I should say. And what that did was that automatically converted our files. It automatically ingested our files, I should say, into Apple ProRes 422, which is the standard editing codec. So we didn't actually have to worry about transcoding except for what's called proxy media. Proxy media is essentially a compressed, shrunken ProRes file that's easier on your machine to edit, particularly if you're editing in 4K or something like that. It just takes a little of the weight off your computer. So that's the transcoding process. So that's something that you're going to want to think about. And then your audio imports, essentially your sound, your audio recordist, your location sound person, will more than likely deliver you something like a WAV file, a WAV file, or another larger format audio file, which they're still pretty small. And you're going to want to bring those in. And once you get those into your editing software, you want to get organized. And I actually tend to do this in my editing software of choice, which is Final Cut X. I actually tend to set up my library, my Final Cut library for the entire project well in advance of production. I do that with almost everything. In fact, I actually just have a standardized kind of library that I use for almost every project, big or small. And I can kind of clone that just empty library with file folder systems already organized, essentially. I can clone that for whatever I'm working on and rename whatever I need to rename. So how that sort of shakes out is I have my library, which is titled whatever the project is titled. And then I have different events, which are essentially kind of folders for housing different aspects of your assets, footage, sound, whatever, music. And what I do is I have those several events, and I have one for raw footage, and that's where all of my raw footage goes. And oftentimes that'll be even subfoldered into the day that it was shot if it's a bigger project like counterintelligence. So I have the raw footage event. And then I also have an event for synchronized footage, which is where my footage goes once the raw footage and the audio files I receive are connected together. And that's kind of ultimately the footage I end up editing with. And then I have a audio library where the audio that I get from, in this case, Tim went. And that audio is merged with the raw footage to create the synced files, which go in the synced footage library. And then I have a sound effects event, and that's where all my sound effects go as I collect them and add them to the project. I have a visual effects event, and within that, often I have, if I have to export and do visual effects in another program, that's where the final exports of those go that then get added to the project. Or if I do like a compositing effect in Final Cut, and I turn that into a compound clip so that it's easier to view, then I add that compound clip to that visual effects event. Then I have a projects event, and that's where all of my actual timelines go. So in this case, what began with me creating projects for different scenes as they were shot and being edited, and then I would create different projects for larger sequences as they were put together. And then there was a project for the full film once that was put together. And that got cloned a couple times as little things changed. But that's essentially the layout. In addition, I created another event for Reels. And that came about once I had to break the full film down into separate sections to export for the sound mix. And that's where those timelines, those projects went. So that's sort of how, that's a really broad overview of how I organize essentially up front to make finding things easier and storing things easier and locating things when they go missing, or I think they go missing, easier. And that's sort of the essentials of file management. And then as far as syncing clips go, Final Cut has a really cool capability where you can actually select a video clip and its corresponding audio clip separately. You can select them, right-click, and hit Synchronize Clips, and it'll kick off basically an automatic synchronization process that works really well, particularly when you slate, when there's the sound of a slate. It kind of knows when to connect and synchronize those clips, versus what used to be the standard, which is where you manually synchronize audio and video. Now, it's done automatically, and with the right audio record and the right video record with audio attached, you can get a pretty clean and pretty quick sync. But do note, with that, once you dump it out to a sound mixer, you actually do have to detach those things. Once again, this is just for editing. You actually have to break those clips apart once they're on your final timelines, so that they can be ingested into the audio mixing software, because audio mixing software doesn't recognize those synchronized clips. So it'll get all screwy. We actually realized towards the end of the process that that was causing some significant problems, and it resulted in me having to go back through all of the timelines, break all of those clips apart, and assign roles, which we'll get into later. So yeah, synchronized clips are definitely your best starting point before you begin the edit, and then they have to be broken out after the fact. The next facet of post is the edit, which I think we covered pretty in depth, so I'm going to keep this pretty brief. It began for me, particularly on counterintelligence, but this is true of the documentary I'm working on right now as well. It begins for me on the scene or sequence level. And that was sort of on counterintelligence dictated by whatever we had shot at that given point. So I was, as I said before in a previous episode, I was editing as I went along in production. So what I was editing, I was limited to by what we had already shot. Obviously, I didn't have the full thing in front of me. Given scenes or sequences or little snippets that we shot on a day-to-day, I would create projects for each of those sequences labeled by scene number or scene numbers that they comprised, and I would cut those together. So it begins really on the scene, at the scene or sequence level. And I would do that anyway, whether I had all the footage in front of me or not. It's just easier to begin by looking at smaller parts. And then what I do is I slowly start refining those smaller parts and just making sure that they're flowing really well, that I don't have any regrettable cuts in there, that everything is looking okay. And then I start combining them, and suddenly those sequences, those scenes become sequences, and the sequences get larger and larger and larger as I combine them. And then I can kind of slowly massage and refine the larger sequences as they go along. And that ultimately results in having larger and larger refined parts of the movie that then you can combine together into a full piece and make sure that the flow is correct over the course of the full piece. You're going to probably be making changes throughout this entire process. Don't expect that you're going to nail a scene, then nail another scene that takes place 20 minutes later, and nail everything in between eventually, and you're slowly combining, and then everything's going to work. Pacing varies. What works in one scene might not necessarily translate to the full film. You might have to remove entire chunks to get the thing going. But I find that process to be most effective in just remaining focused on singular small parts and then expanding that out slowly. And once you've combined into the full and you're massaging that, that's when you really start previewing it for people, although I would recommend previewing small sequences for people too. Once you have the longer full piece, that's when you start previewing it for people, and that also helps dictate some moves that you make, some changes that you make. If you're making drastic changes, you might want to clone that full timeline so you have a couple versions of it so you can always kind of backtrack to where you were before. But really what you want to do is start previewing and making more nuanced changes once you hit that full timeline. Throughout the edit process, you should be singularly focused on getting a locked picture, because once you have a locked picture, then you can really advance in the process more. There's not a lot that you can do. I suppose you could start color correcting, but it's kind of becomes a distraction and a waste of time. There's not a lot of substantial stuff that you can do without a locked picture. A locked picture, again, meaning the film in its final cut form. I should say final edited form. You shouldn't be making a lot of changes or really any changes to the edits themselves once your picture is locked. Picture lock means this is what we're working with. This is the film that an audience will see, minus a lot of the spit, shine, and polish. So that's what you should be gunning for once you start combining it and playing with different arrangements or whatever the case may be. Aim for a locked picture. Then you can advance to the next stage, the next facet, which is color. Color is kind of a tricky thing. As I sort of clarified in the last episode, I really, really love this process to a detrimental point. I obsess over it. I find it really engaging and I find it really fun, but it can be a bit of a time suck because I can just work on it kind of forever. Here's some kind of overarching methodology to apply to color. The first thing you want to do is, per scene, you want to pick a shot, like a favorite shot in that scene. If you're color correcting yourself, you want to pick a favorite shot in that scene, a shot that you think best represents that scene, and color correct that first. So you color correct it, make sure that you get the color balance correct, and that will dictate how you balance the rest of the scene, which ideally, when you're color correcting and you're color balancing, you're just doing it to make sure that it's color accurate. So your whites are white, and it looks basically like raw footage of where you were. Because a lot of times, especially on a run and gun micro budget film, you're not really going to have time to get like a solid white balance. So you want to make sure that you get it back to a solid white balance, or just to a solid white balance. And that's color correction. Then you want to grade that shot and create the look of that scene just on that one shot. And from there, what you're able to do, once you have the look established on that one shot, now you can color correct the rest of the scene so it matches just that raw color corrected form on that one shot. And then you can just apply that color grade, the stylistic color grade, to the rest of the scene. And you've finished what could have been a lengthy time-suck task in a lot less time because you maintained your focus. So start with one shot that you really like, color correct it, get it balanced, then do a color grade for style, maybe do a couple if you need to, test a couple things out if you want, refine it, but do all of that refining on that one shot and then carry that out through the remainder of the scene. And there's a couple little tools, particularly I know that this exists with Color Finale, which I used for coloring. And I know that it exists on other coloring platforms too. There's what's called layers that are adjustment layers, and then there's look layers. So an adjustment layer is basically a color correction layer, and that kind of lays over your footage, lays into your footage, and then you can add another layer, which essentially is a title, basically an empty title that you can just paste a look onto, and that could be your full scene look. So if you want to just color balance on the clips themselves, and then apply one look to the entire scene, you just lay an adjustment layer over it from the beginning of the scene to the end of the scene. Again, it's like a title, laying it on top of the scene and dragging it out to the end, and then just paste your look on top of there. Once everything's matched up, that look should just apply across. So that's a really good tool for kind of batch color grading after you've sort of uniquely color corrected each fragment. And those are my biggest sort of suggestions for the color facet and staying productive. Pick a shot that you think best represents the scene. Hint, hint, a wide shot is a really good place to start because you sort of establish how the space looks. Pick a shot that you feel best represents the scene. Color balance it. Then color balance the rest of the clips around that so that they look like they're in the same space, and then apply a grade, an actual final look across all of them. And then let's move on to the next facet from there, sound design. So sound design is where you really paint the auditory picture of the movie. You're adding things like ambience and sound effects, and obviously a lot of times people cut to music, but really refining how the music plays out in the film. You're really creating all of the sort of soundscape texture of the film and sound design. You can get as crazy as you want here. We got, for such a simple film, I got pretty crazy with this, and it actually didn't take me a whole lot of time. It was really, really fun. But what I did from here was I broke the film into the reels that I would need to eventually send off to sound mixing. So Counterintelligence is, once it was broken out, is comprised of 6 different reels, and they vary in length anywhere from 10 minutes to 12 or 14 minutes, and the final reel is actually only 6 minutes. But breaking it out into reels makes it a little easier to manage. It makes it a lot easier to sound mix when the time comes. It's just easier to kind of take in as you're working with it, and it's easier on your machine ultimately. But so I broke it out into reels, and then what I did was I would watch each reel. I would lay down a time code generator, which is, if you don't know what that is, it's that running clock that shows you hours, minutes, seconds, and frames going by. You see it on a lot of like blooper reels and things like that. So I would lay down a time code generator over each reel. And then what I would do is I would review each reel, and I would make time-coded notes on what sounds needed to go where. And that would inform what I went looking for in terms of sound effects, and it would inform, once I found those sound effects, where I laid them down. So I would make time-coded notes for the entire reel, one reel at a time, and then I would go find my sounds. And there's a few ways to attain sounds for your film. You can, there's production sounds, so sometimes you record things like wild stuff that Tim talked about in the production episodes, where if there's a specific sound effect, like say a character's running, Tim might pick up wild sounds of that character's feet hitting the ground, and then you can re-add those later. So those would be an example of production sound effects you get on site. And then there's online, and that's actually where we got the vast majority of our sound effects, and that was from freesounds.org. And that's I explained it in the episode, so I'm not going to belabor it here, but it's a great free resource for downloading basically open source sounds that people put up into the ether, recordists put up into the ether, be they amateur or professional. And you can download sound banks from there, or you can download sounds from their sound bank. And then there's also paid resources where you can get a little more consistent and high quality sounds. And then also there's the option of recording. If there's something that you need that you're not finding anywhere, you can record sounds. So there's a couple instances where I did that. If I needed a certain sound of typing or something like that, I would record it myself if I wasn't finding anything that was sufficient. And there's one in particular sound that I recorded for a laugh that I think you may or may not notice in the film once you see it. So recording your sounds to lay in is another option, but you can't really record unless you know specifically what you need. And then what I did is I take all those sounds that I've sourced, and I hit my list again of time code, and I go back through the project and I just lay in those sounds. And I do that without making any edits to them. I just lay them down. And then as far as once those sounds are laid in, I do basically, when you export them to the sound mixer, they're going to lose any effects you put on them for the most part. They're going to lose any fades or transitions that you put on them for the most part. So I choose to not really focus a ton of attention on how well I mix them. But why I do mix them a little bit is when you ship it out to a sound mixer, each reel, you ship with an accompanying video file that they can compare the audio that they're mixing against. And that's called a reference file. So they'll kill the sound on that entirely and just mix onto the silent film. So they're mixing against only picture, but they will reference that file occasionally if they're concerned that something might be off, or they just want to see what you may or may not have done. So a good example is every time the radio voice comes on, which we established in the first episode on editing. Every time the radio voice comes on in the movie, I had affected that a little bit just so Mike knew what I kind of wanted it to sound like when he was mixing. He could have guessed what a radio would sound like, but there were some specific tones for specific locations I kind of wanted. So there is a logic to just sort of like briefly going through and doing like a cursory mix of what you add once you sound design, but don't get too nitty gritty about it because most of the time it's gonna get lost. So again, recap: sound design, you want to break it into reels, review, make time coded notes, go find your sounds, record, find them online, dig through your production archive, lay in those sounds, and then do a real cursory mix over what you've done. Then you can advance to the sound mix. And at the point of the sound mix, what Mike had requested that I do was add a few seconds of black to the first part of each reel. So it opens on just a black screen, and add a couple little pop sounds so that he could know what was synced where. And then extend out that time code generator and have it start at a certain time on every single reel. And you can coordinate that with your sound mixer. Mike had some specifications he wanted. So that was sort of the first step. And then I would add a title to each reel on that black, so he knew what reel he was on from that black screen from the very beginning. And then what I did was I went through the entirety of each reel and I labeled. I created roles for all of the audio. So there are different roles that you can assign in Final Cut. I'm sure Adobe has some sort of similar feature, though admittedly I don't know what it is because it's been a while since I've used it. But for roles, what you're doing is basically assigning metadata to each audio file, and it color codes them, at least within Final Cut, to let your system know and to let your XML file, which you're later going to export from Final Cut, know what each audio file on the timeline is. Otherwise, it's just a big wall of sounds and your sound mixer is going to have to sort through it. So I went through every single sound on the timeline and assigned a role. You can do dialogue roles, sound effects roles, ambient roles, or music roles, and you can create your own roles with their own colors if you so choose. So for dialogue, I did it by character. And what that means is there's a dialogue role, and then I created sub-roles for each character in the film, assign them each their own sub-role under the dialogue heading. So all the dialogue would be lumped onto like one fader in Logic where the sound was mixed, but all of those sub-channels would live in that fader and be collapsible or expandable if they needed to be accessed. And then with sound effects, I just sort of did a blanket thing, labeled all the sound effects. Same with ambience, just labeled them all ambience. And music, I labeled as music. The only other additional role I created was for the radio voice, so that could sort of sit separately. So I created a whole new role, not a sub-role, for the radio. And also that just sort of helped me compartmentalize it so it had a different color, just looking at it. I'm a visual person, if you couldn't tell by the fact that I make films. So after I've assigned all these roles, I export each reel as an XML file. And you can get an actual tutorial of this by going to showhawk.com/makethismovie. I included a tutorial in the last episode's toolkit. So you can see exactly how actually all of these processes work, including the XML creation. So you export an XML, you deliver the XML and reference videos, so the videos with the sound, just a low-resolution QuickTime file to the mixer, XML and the low-res QuickTime file to the mixer, And what they're going to do is they're going to mix the dialogue first, probably, and then mix in the ambience, mix in the sound effects, and finally the music, just like Mike said. And again, for an actual detailed visual breakdown of this, check out showhawk.com/makethismovie. The toolkit for episode 10 is the place you want to look for all of these tutorials, including the next and final facet of post-production, VFX. I have a lot more, because this is kind of tough to explain over audio, as we established in episode 10. I included some tutorials that I used personally to kind of help me along. And the main things that I will say over audio for VFX are just, it helps to have a plan. It kind of goes back to organization, but it helps to have a pretty clear idea even before you shoot of your VFX shots. So, for instance, in the storyboards, I would actually draw in or notate on each board what was going to be a VFX shot. So I knew going in how many I would need, where, when, approximately how long they would take, because I knew kind of what I was adding. I was adding blood bursts and gunshot muzzle flashes, and for some people that stuff seems pretty complicated. It was a little intimidating a while back for me, but now I have a pretty good handle on how to do that. Again, there's tutorials that I included that I used on showhawk.com/makethismovie. So you can see that there. But the only additional piece of information that I'll add here as far as those assets go, because when you're adding in muzzle flashes from guns or blood assets, you need those assets. You need the actual muzzle flash and you need the actual blood burst. Now, you can shoot those or you can buy them prefabbed. And I chose to buy them because to shoot them is actually quite the time commitment, honestly. You have to have the right green screen setup, the right lighting conditions, all of this stuff. When you can just buy a prefab thing, particularly if it's quick, and you think that it's going to be pretty easy to integrate into the movie, I ended up just buying prefab stuff. And I got that from a website called Detonation Films. They have been around forever, and their website will prove it. Their website looks super old, but the selection that they have is pretty outstanding. They've amassed quite the library of stuff that you can buy at really competitive prices. We're talking like $10-15 for packs of like blood bursts and bullets hitting the ground and ricochets and muzzle flashes off of different types of guns from different angles, from the side, from the front. Smoke effects, all kinds of stuff. And you can get real creative with those. So I went to Detonation Films to get those. I downloaded a few different packs over time, tried out different things, and eventually landed on what I used in the film. And again, opted not to make my own. It was just faster and more efficient to do it this way. And to add in muzzle flashes, again, I'm not going to go super into detail on this because it is really hard to explain over audio, but to add these in, what you want to be doing is utilizing transparencies. So a lot of these pre-purchased assets will come with a transparency background, and they may not translate that way immediately, but you can bring them onto your timeline as transparency, so all that shows up is the flash and not like a black background or a green background. If they come in as green screen assets, then all you have to do is key them out, which should be relatively simple on most nonlinear editing systems. You key them out, and then you kind of have to mask around them sometimes. Like I had a few gunshots that were filmed from behind the person. So when you add the muzzle flash, you have to kind of mask around the gun so it looks like you're looking past the gun at the blast. So those are little masking things. Again, I've gotten pretty comfortable with this stuff. And the cool thing about adding in gunshots most of the time is that they're quick. So when you're masking around a gun, you're really only doing it for like a frame. It's not like you have to motion track it. But with motion tracking, like with a blood effect or something like that, there were a few cases where I had to motion track the image, meaning like you attach the bullet wound or blood to like a body or to a ground, but the camera's shaky. So the blood and the stuff doesn't go with the camera because it shouldn't. You have to motion track to affix that asset to a certain point within the frame. So when the camera's shaking, it still looks like it's looking at something that's actually on the ground or on a person. And that can actually be made quite a bit easier by either using Motion or After Effects. They kind of automate that for you, and I included those tutorials on showhawk.com/makethismovie as well. So motion tracking is also something to be thinking about. The final kind of step once you add these sort of simpler special effects or any special effects is to color correct them into the scene. You want to integrate these effects, which are usually if you're buying them or if you're shooting them, they're not shot in the same lighting conditions or color temperature or anything as your final film. So therein lies the importance of having your film color corrected before you add these, because you want to add these to your final image and then color correct them in to your final image so they sort of seamlessly integrate into your scene. And that's the ultimate goal with special effects. You want them to sort of seamlessly integrate into the fabric of your movie and not jump out at the audience as special effects, but just play as a part of the story. So those are kind of the major facets of post-production that you want to keep in mind going into the process. File management, the edit, color, sound design, sound mix, and visual effects. Towards the end there, the order is sort of interchangeable. The main thing is locking the edit and being able to move on from there. And a lot of these other aspects can run in parallel. Now, from here on out, that was the bulk of it. We're going to go through the rest pretty quickly. But the next aspect I want to cover is doing post from the start. Post begins with writing. You write, to some extent, the broader film that you want to edit. Now, I don't personally go back to the script much once I'm editing, but you do sort of give yourself a framework within which to work. You also, within the writing process, you establish to a great extent things like tone, you establish how much special effects you're going to need, etc. So you're sort of doing some preliminary post work in writing if you're paying attention to what you're writing and how you're writing it. And that continues into the budget and schedule. And once you're in the budget and scheduling stage, then you really have to get nitty gritty about things like effects. The locations start to dictate tone even further, and you're sort of funneling down into something even more granular and specific and giving yourself even tighter parameters within which to work. And then even further into pre-production, you're coming up with more creative details. As you talk to your DP, you're establishing what the look will be. Now, granted, Mike and I decided on flat because Mike knows that I can color correct. So he knew that I was capable of coming up with the tone. But we did talk a lot about tone. We exchanged films that we both liked, one of which I referenced in the editing section. We exchanged Michael Clayton. I really like the look of that film, and I like, even more than how it turned out, I liked what they were going for. So we talked a lot about that, but in there you can kind of establish the visual grammar, and that will impact your color. It'll also impact the tempo of your editing to a great extent if you're talking about visual grammar. You're also establishing the feel, and there you can also kind of be thinking about, how the sound is going to play out. What kind of sounds are you going to want? How crazy do you want to get? How demanding is the sound design going to be? The scheduling period also gives you the flexibility of understanding how early you can start post. So part of the reason that we scheduled to shoot in 1 week separations, and in one case 2 week separations, was so I could edit in the middle and be piecing it together and know if we were missing anything. And that was basically me planning around post. And then you also establish some technical details in pre-production. Like I said, I have a template Final Cut library that I work off for almost every other project. I was able to set that up for Counterintelligence 3 weeks before we started shooting, so that by the time we got to shoot day one and it came time for me to be importing those files, I had a place to take them that was prefabbed and ready to go. And then in addition, as far as technical details that you iron out in pre-prep, you're able to talk to your DP about what types of files are going to be coming in, so you can plan for that import process, because quite often it does take time, and you can figure out what you're up against in terms of time with that. And then in addition, you can talk to your location sound mixer, who will tell you what kinds of files you're getting in, how they're going to structure those files. Are they going to clean those files up at all? Like what are they going to do? How are they going to package them? Tim packaged them in a very specific way. If he recorded lavalier mics and a boom mic, he would mash those all together into one track separated on different channels. So there's some specifics that you're going to want to get a hold of from your various collaborators, your various departments. And that'll dictate how you synchronize those files, how you handle editing those files, and ultimately how those files are mixed. So you're going to want to do that communication, and that'll help also streamline post-production. So let's move on quickly to managing post-production flow. And this is a bit redundant from the post-production facets part, but I just want to reiterate it here because I do think it's super important to understand this efficiency funnel of the filmmaking, the post-production process. Focus on first dialing in scenes, then slowly add those scenes together, then combine the full film. And focus on locking the picture, then everything else can fall into place. And a good workaround for getting yourself to the place where you can, the quicker you can get your film off to the mixer and to the colorist, the sooner you have a finished film. So one great tool that you can use that I'm definitely going to use next time is, instead of working on nailing down specific visual effects, what I'm going to do in the future is I'm going to temp in visual effects and then get it off to the mixer with sound design done before even finalizing those effects. So I can sound design, or my future sound designer can sound design around temporary effects that are fairly well comped in, but just not completely solidified. They can do that, the mixing on that, while I'm finalizing the effects and the color and things like that. All of these things can happen in parallel. Anything that doesn't involve cutting or changing audio can be done while the sound is being mixed. And that was a hard lesson I learned on this film. I was really trying to nail out all of the visual components before handing it off to a sound mixer, which turned out to be an inordinate waste of time and a decision that I will never, ever make again. So know that once you're done cutting at the frame level, actually editing, and your dialogue is clear, you can start sound designing, especially if you temp in visual effects if you need them. And then it can go off to the mixer, and you can be working on two entirely different processes at the same time and turn your movie around a lot quicker. That's the biggest reason that I wanted to come back to this subsequent to covering it a bit earlier. Managing the post-production flow is really important. Really understanding what each department is doing is really crucial and really, really helpful, because the more you can kind of manage those relationships and their various jobs, the quicker you can turn around your film. And films take a while quite often, but I know that next time I'm going to be trying to do this in like a quarter of the time for a narrative like this, if not a little less even. So I'm really focusing in on where I can make improvements, and that alone would be a massive one. So I highly recommend taking that approach. The next section that I want to get into, and this is the second to last section, is collaboration. Collaboration in post. Who will you be collaborating with, and what are some best practices? So I edited this film. I didn't work with an editor, but I am an editor, and I've worked with other filmmakers in the past. I've worked in industrial work. I work with clients. So I know what life is like as an editor. So some suggestions that I have for if you're going to approach an editor are, first of all, find someone with your cinematic sensibilities. Find someone where, cinema is a language for people who love it and do it. It's a language. It's a way of connecting with people. You know that feeling where you can sit down with somebody and just completely bond or connect over taste in a single piece of cinema. So find someone with your same language where what that establishes is a shorthand. You can allude to things, or make references that they'll actually understand. So find an editor with your cinematic sensibilities. And then another great thing that I've really taken to using, particularly on the documentary I'm working on with my Showhawk co-founder, Mike, is using Vimeo Pro's reviews feature. So if you have a Vimeo Pro account, there's a cool feature called reviews. And what that allows is you can send a file to someone and they can go through and actually make notes within a video that are time coded, and you, the editor, can kind of, or the editor that you hire, can kind of skip through those notes and it'll jump to that point in the video, and you can lay a dot down that'll tag those notes on a part of the frame that you don't like, or on a cut that you don't like, or you can just leave an arbitrary note like, I don't really like the way this line plays back with the other one, or whatever. You can leave any kind of note that'll go straight to that point in the picture. That's a great way to sort of streamline the editing process. I've used that as an editor and as a director before, and in the case of Mike Hall and I, we're using that as co-producers, me being the editor and director as well. It's been largely helpful. So I highly recommend using Vimeo Pro's reviews feature. Also, and this is true with any other collaborator, and I feel we've sort of beat this to death throughout, but I just want to give a quick reminder, be clear with your instructions. If there's something really specific that you feel a scene needs or you want for the cut or a cut, be super specific. Don't beat around the bush. Don't be vague. Hone in on the details and give them as close to a perfect picture of what you want and as unambiguous a picture of what you want as possible. It'll only benefit in the long run. Don't be oppressive. And also this goes in hand with letting them, take some risks and make some changes within a safe zone, of course. But be really specific. Don't beat around the bush with your needs and your instructions. And also with their ability to experiment and riff, you can control this if you're editing. Just remind your editor, even though they should probably already know, if they're going to make drastic experiments, they should duplicate whatever project they're working on. So they should never completely overwrite, an existing version of the film or an existing version of a scene that looks good. If they're going to try to, play around with it and get a little crazy with it, they should duplicate it and do that separately. And then also, I guess, as an editor, what benefits me when I'm working with someone is when they speak my language. So speak an editor's language. Get to know your frames and pixels. How what it sounds super simple to a lot of people, but really understand when you watch something, when you watch a second of something, 24 frames pass, in a sort of standard scenario of a scene. 24 frames pass in a second. You should know to some extent, I think we need to take 5-6 frames off here, and that'll change the entire tone of that exchange. Or I think we need to add 48 frames or something like that. Get to know your editor's language if in fact you're working with one, and that includes frames. And then as far as pixels go, that's more of a visual, graphical element and things like that. But, you might be wanting to crop in a shot or something like that, or refer to a part of the shot, something that needs to change in the upper left quadrant, that's on there's a level of pixelation or something happening. Get to know your pixels and your frames. I think that's really beneficial working with an editor. And then as far as working with a composer, ultimately the big thing that you want to keep at the forefront of your mind is that the music needs to fit your film and not just be cool. It can't necessarily, I see this mistake happen quite a bit, even in professional, big budget films. I see music being plugged into things that you can tell it's just it's what the people making it and it's not necessarily fitting the environment of the film. Sometimes ill-fitting music does work. Like a good example I can think of is The Knick, Steven Soderbergh's excellent show about late 1800s hospitals in New York, or a late 1800s hospital in New York. It's a period piece, and it's very dark and tonal and gritty, but it has an electronic score. And it shouldn't work, but for whatever reason, at least I think it works. So sometimes it doesn't, but you have to be thoughtful about it. And really, it's because it tonally fits. the tone of the music fits. So you have to think in terms of what music fits this film and not just what's cool or what you would personally, bump when you're driving home. And then communicate your ideas clearly. Again, I feel that bears no more explanation. A good thing to do, I found, is provide reference tracks to your composer. I like to provide some music that I've been listening to throughout making the film, maybe music I like to listen to when I was writing, or just music that I think sort of tonally fits the objective of the film. As I said or as Noah referenced in the last episode, I had mentioned that I like the idea of doing spy music. And though we went a little far from that in terms of what we conventionally think is spy music, there is definitely a spy vibe to the music in the film. And so he was able to kind of hone in on that. So provide some reference points and some reference tracks. If you have specific songs, I sent Noah a huge playlist for Light, and I think on some level that definitely helped out. So if you can provide some sort of reference materials, that's really good. And also ask for reference tracks from them. I love getting music from Noah anyway because he's so invested in finding obscure shit that I would never find on my own. I love getting recommendations for him or him sending me, tracks to listen to. But in this case, it really helps to get reference tracks so like of what's inspiring them and what they're listening to and what they're thinking. If they could send you similar bands, like Noah sent me a couple bands early on and working on Counterintelligence, and I was like, cool, I like where your head is at, because it gave me a sense for sort of what was running through his mind and what different ingredients he wanted to bring in. And then I was also able to address in these reference tracks, well, I don't really like this aspect of this music. Is this what you were thinking? And he would either say, oh yeah, okay, well, that's good to know. Or he would say something like, no, what I really like is the guitar here, not the drums, or something like that. And then I was able to sort of paint a clear picture. So just reference materials exchanged is really helpful. And then once you start receiving stuff, be respectful of their craft. Like, be respectful of what goes into it. If you yourself are not a musician, like, I'm not a musician at all, but I have enormous respect for musicians. Frankly, I don't fully understand how they do what they do, especially when they're really, really, really good and really inventive. I don't fully understand how they sort of mentally do what they do. So be respectful of your composers and that they have their own creative process, and it's important and as it belongs to them and as it belongs to your film. But also don't be afraid to say, this isn't fitting, because they are there to do something very specific. Don't be afraid to say, what you're making might be good, but it's not necessarily fitting the film, the tone of the film, or it's not necessarily fitting where this cohesive vision needs to go. That's really important. You are ultimately the ringleader of the full vision. So moving on to working with a sound mixer, what I've found helpful in this case and with Light previously, where I worked with someone else, provide as much organization as possible for them up front. So in this case, I've already gone through how I assigned roles to all the audio tracks and all that. There's different layers of organization that you can just do for a sound mixer, or if you have an assistant editor, as we established, can be really helpful. They can set that up for your sound mixer, but provide as much of that for them as you can. It'll reduce a lot of work on the back end, or once they receive what they need to be working on. Also, once they start sending you versions of their mixes, I highly recommend testing each version on multiple sources. And this is just something I've always done. I test it on, nicer speakers. I test the output on headphones. I test it on laptop, TV, just a TV with no speakers, and I test it on a cell phone. And it's just so I can see if the important things are coming through as intended on each device. It's just a good thing to do. And, in the case of like Mike, I'm pretty sure Mike will probably do something similar to this anyway, but I just like to know for my own edification if it's coming through as I intend on all those different platforms, because the reality is that's where people watch stuff now. I mean, they watch stuff all over the place. So, and I'll go as far as testing on a variety of different speakers and headphones. I'll test on like standard Apple iPhone earbuds, and I'll test on like nicer Bose headphones or nicer Sony headphones or whatever the case may be. So I like to test across a lot of different platforms and mediums and things like that, and I highly recommend doing that. Also, similar to working with an editor, learn to speak their language as much, sound mixer's language as much as possible. Learn how to talk about the software they're in. You don't need to know it super well, but get a good purview on, like, watch a couple tutorial videos. It takes 15-20 minutes to watch a few videos and get an overarching idea of what it is they do and how they do it, and sort of understand how to meet them where they are. When they talk about faders, when they talk about buses, when they talk about outputs, I'm not going to go into that right now, but I highly recommend looking into it if you're going to have somebody sound mixing. If you can speak their language a little better, then you can give more specific instructions, and they're not going to be trying to sort of translate what your layman's speech is into something that actually applies to what they do. You're really doing it as a courtesy to them, so you're not talking in circles around something or getting frustrated when it's not coming out the way that you want it to. They're going to start internalizing that as them doing something wrong, and I can guarantee you, if you're not an audio person working with an audio person and you're getting frustrated because it's not coming together the way you want, more often than not, you're not able to communicate what you need to communicate in an adequate way. I continue to run into this all the time, and it's just important to educate yourself a little bit so you can meet them where they are. And then the last thing with sound mixing is you want to provide clear export objectives and instructions for them for the end of the road. Where the final audio file is going to go, how are they going to connect to your film projects in your editing software? How are you eventually going to export them? Are they going to be stereo? Are they going to be surround? You want to be able to establish all that from the outset before the mix even starts. Where's the final resting place? And you do kind of want to begin with the end in mind with pretty much every facet of the filmmaking process. Sound mixing is not an exception. And the last little aspect we're going to cover here as far as collaboration is with a colorist. Again, I colored this myself, so I'm mostly going off of some past projects where I had someone else color and my lessons from coloring this project myself. Communicate ideas clearly, as always, and then provide reference films or frames. This is a really good tactic, and it actually helped me reel in my own approach when I was getting too experimental and getting lost in the weeds and I didn't really have a lot of direction with what I was doing. I was trying too many things and wasting too much time. I finally just went to the films that I knew were sort of on the tip of my tongue or like in the front of my mind when I was sort of establishing a look mentally. And what I ended up doing was holding those, putting those frames on a second monitor next to my color correcting monitor, and I was literally matching to those frames just to see if I could. And then I could go from there and further fine-tune the look. But giving reference frames or reference films, particularly when you're working with someone else, a colorist, it gives them a point off which they can work. And then you can kind of fine-tune it, little adjustments from there. And then in addition, if something looks off, ask about their intentions with it. Instead of coming at them like, why does this look, wrong? You messed this up or whatever. I mean, not that anyone, I hope not a lot of people would do that. I'm sure there's some monsters out there. In fact, I know there are, but don't come at it that way. There's a good chance that them being a professional and knowing what they're doing, they made a decision, and there's a good chance that they weighed that decision among a host of other available options. So get to the bottom of why they made certain decisions. If something's not looking exactly how you'd anticipated. And then assume that a pro would fix something if they could, and then ask about it. So it kind of goes back to that same philosophy of assuming that they know that they would do that what they're doing and that they weigh every decision against the host of other options. Assume that if something's broken or appears to be broken that didn't get fixed, assume that they would have fixed it if they could have, but they didn't for a specific reason. And then ask them, this area looks a bit problematic. This is more beyond aesthetics. This is something that might be messed up in the frame or imbalanced or off. This area looks a little problematic. Did you have a specific reason for balancing it the way you did or grading it the way that you did in spite of that? And a lot of times you might get an answer like, yeah, so if I tweak that window, then it would tweak the entire color, within the rest of the frame. There was just no way around it or something. So it's a good way to sort of de-escalate things from that standpoint, really understanding, that their decisions are not just on a whim or lazy or informed. A lot of times they're triaging their decision-making on color. So approach it that way. And the big catch-all with collaborations is deadlines are important. They matter. They matter just with yourself, but they also matter quite a bit with collaborators. Make sure you have clearly defined deadlines that they can work to. And then if you're working with a VFX artist, a visual effects artist, or a visual effects house, I found that when I started working with visual effects houses and visual effects artists on more commercial projects or industrial projects, they'll actually hold your hand through a lot of the process. I was super intimidated the first time I did a project for a big client that involved a good amount of special effects, and it was a big budget project and all this. I was really, really intimidated. I kept that on the low, but in my head and in my heart, I was super intimidated. And what I found was that the VFX company, who was really reputable, they'd done a lot of big stuff. They were really cool. They really held my hand. They weren't bothered by the fact that I was shooting it on DSLR. That was something I was really self-conscious about. They were very cool. And they did something that I would highly recommend if you're going to have a visual effects artist or house work on your project with you. They showed up to set. They sent somebody to set to hang out and watch us actually shoot the key shots and help us kind of stage them and work them out with us. So I would highly recommend that if at all possible, and it's not too much of an extra cost. Also, providing storyboards is super helpful. Asking about their process before you jump into it, asking from the outset, how does this work on your end so that I can sort of reverse engineer this to be effective for you and ultimately effective for both of us. And then, have them on set in that process. It helps out quite a bit. So the final thing that I want to cover here in this BTF episode, this is the actual final thing, not just the final section of another thing, but the final thing that I want to cover here in this final BTF episode of the season is the creative post process. So your job as producer, as director, and in some cases on a micro budget film or otherwise as the editor and as the person doing most of the post, is to keep the project on the rails. You're sort of overseeing yourself, and it's important to set those deadlines, not just for other people, but for yourself. Set clear dates that you need to deliver things by, set clear dates that certain things need to be done. Like if you're trying to lock picture so that you can get it off to a sound mixer, or you need to add temp effects, set dates by which you need to insert those temporary effects before the sound design can happen, or set a date that you need to finish that sound design for to get it to the next collaborator, whatever the case may be. Set deadlines on yourself. It's super, super helpful. Also, setting time limits on the experiments that you do. This is something I eventually learned down the line with the color correction process that allowed me to speed it up and restart and just get the whole thing done in a month, is setting time limits on the experiments I could do. I would give myself 30 minutes to play with a single shot. And if I wasn't hitting it by minute 25, I was watching the clock, then I had to make decisions in 5 minutes. So setting time limits on your experiments really focuses your attention and energy. I actually do that quite a bit with writing now. It's been an interesting experiment since I don't have a ton of free time at the moment, working on the podcast, finishing Counterintelligence, working on this documentary. I have a day job still. Since I don't have a ton of free time, I actually schedule my writing in 10-minute increments, and it really forces me to focus. So setting those kinds of experimental limits, it's about as important as setting deadlines. And then also processing every decision through the world of the story is super important. I feel like we've covered this in a cursory way throughout the other episodes, but I want to reiterate it in the post-production process because it's super, super crucial. This is where your film is getting done. This is the final film. This is what people are going to see. Whatever audience is in front of their TV, their computer, in a theater maybe, at a festival, and watching your film, they're not seeing the script. They're not seeing the journey. They're not seeing the A to Z in every decision you made. Frankly, most of them don't give a shit about every decision that you made. What they're seeing is what's on screen. Their context for your film is only based on the amount of minutes into that film they are. That's about all they know. That's about all they need to know. To craft that experience, you have to be making the same film. You have to be committing to the film that you want the audience to see without any questions. That is your job. So process every decision through the world of the story, or just through the world of the film that you want the audience to see. And work always for the betterment of the movie that you're making. That's the final point on this creative process and the final point of this BTF episode, because it really does encompass every stage of the filmmaking process. You want to always be working for the betterment of the movie you're making. Every decision should boil down to making the film better. That's all I got for BTF. We're a couple episodes away from the end of season 1. Thanks for coming along this far with Between the Frames. I hope you like these little segments. Again, don't forget to leave a review. Don't forget to rate. Don't forget to share this with your friends. And thank you so much. Thanks for coming along. See you next time. If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. While you're there, you could totally leave us a rating or a comment or both if you so choose. Those are easy ways to help spread the word to other listeners who like the same stuff as you. Music for the show comes from our film, Counterintelligence, and was composed by the great Noah Simons, who you can find on SoundCloud or Bandcamp as Larians, Larians, and his band, Male Blonding, on Bandcamp, iTunes, and Spotify. They're super good. Make This Movie is brought to you by Showhawk Media. If you're a filmmaker who wants even more useful info and tools, visit showhawk.com/makethismovie and sign up to access our free micro-budget producer starter kit, including template spreadsheets, documents, and other great stuff we cover throughout this series, ready for you to fill in the blanks. That's showhawk.com/makethismovie. Visit counterflick.com for more information on Counterintelligence, the movie, including fun stuff like our satirical fake news page. Also on Facebook is Counterintelligence, Twitter, and Instagram @Counterflick. I'm Chris Socker. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.